All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the session, Audubon Conservation Ranching. You've all probably heard this many times already, but again, just a reminder to please use the Q&A box on the right for all questions, and the chat function can be used for all other comments. Today, our presenter is Ashley Steinke, the Wisconsin grassland ecologist for Audubon Great Lakes, who leads the Audubon Conservation Ranching program in Wisconsin. In his role, he works with beef grazers in Wisconsin to enroll in the program by establishing and/or improving grassland bird habitat on their ranches. Ashley will be helping build an Audubon Great Lakes grassland bird initiative in Wisconsin with ACR and other future opportunities. With that, I'm pleased to welcome Ashley.
Good morning, everybody. Before I get started on our talk today, none of you can see me, which is really strange to me, but every talk that I give when I start out, I like to do what I learned from Chris Cruzy. I'm in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, and Chris Cruzy is our local music celebrity who I think took second in The Voice a few years ago, and I went to one of his concerts, and he had everybody stand up and wave at him, and he took a selfie with the whole crowd, and it was like 500 new friends, he called it. So real quick, everybody, I can't see you, but wave at me real quick. I'm going to take a real quick photo that I have, document my talk today. So anyway, my name is Ashley Steinke, and why am I here today? To talk to you guys about the Audubon Conservation Ranching Program. But before I do that, let me give you a little bit of background about myself. I started going to the prairie when I was 11 years old in East Central South Dakota. My dad took me out there. It led me to a love of the wide open landscapes, the native grasses, the wildflowers that were out there, and the wildlife that depended on it. And I fell in love so much with it that I actually went to grad school at South Dakota State University so I could live on the prairie. Ended up chasing my wife back home to Wisconsin. That's why I'm back here. But my wife is also in the conservation world for her career. And when we moved back, the first property we bought, we restored about a 10-acre native warm season prairie on it. And that started sort of a life of conservation practices on our own lands. And then we built a wetland mitigation site. We planted another 100 acres of native warm season prairie. And we kept doing this on our property, and that eventually brought me to my life that it is now. The white cows you can see on my screen are some of my cows. So we transitioned from always just restoring prairie to having restored prairie and other cool season grasslands to raise a cow-calf herd, to which we sell beef on a direct market basis under the name Sedgewood Farms in Wisconsin. When the job came up with Audubon to work with farmers throughout Wisconsin to promote grassland birds, wasn't really looking for another job. Farm was keeping me plenty busy, raising animals, raising kids, selling beef, but the opportunity to work with farmers to promote what I was already doing on my own lands was too much to pass up. So I threw in a resume, an application, and here I am today, a year and a half later into the program. So the talk today is going to kind of be what ACR is, but also what we have done in this first year and a half that we've been in Wisconsin, and how it can relate to the prairie ecosystem, and how we can restore more acres of prairie in Wisconsin through the use of cattle grazing and bison grazing. So the next slide is going to be a 1-minute video, which is sort of a 1-minute moment of Zen for you all this morning. So I just want you to sit back, close your eyes, imagine that so where I'm sitting, there's 10 inches of snow on the ground, it's 5 degrees outside, but imagine it's an April morning and you're sitting on a prairie in central Nebraska or east central Wisconsin or South Dakota, and it's a video of prairie chickens dancing. So just take a minute, close your eyes, and we're gonna have a little moment of Zen. Now, there is no bird that embodies the prairie, in my opinion, than the greater prairie chicken. And that sound echoes for miles on the landscape. In that video, if you listen closely, you could also hear western meadowlarks. There was a grasshopper sparrow in there, and it's that whole ecosystem that is needed to survive, that's needed for those birds to survive. So from that moment of Zen and thinking about those birds and what they need, we're going to go through real quickly about the doom of all this and where we're actually at in North America right now. There's a famous study that came out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in 2019 that looked at our bird populations across North America and showed that we've lost almost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. So 3 billion birds off the landscape since 1970. Of those 3 billion birds, grassland birds are the suite of species that are declining the most. We've lost 720 million grassland birds. Eastern meadowlarks, we've lost 75% across their range. It's been documented 53% population loss in grassland birds since 1970. So an organization like Audubon, well, let me go back here. So when I'm going to talk about grazing today and having cattle and bison on farms, when I travel the state of Wisconsin, the only place I now see swallows are on grazing farms. We've lost 160 million insectivores since 1970. 2 in 5 barn swallows have been lost. Like I said, the only place that I see these things when I travel the state is in and on around grazing farms. So why the focus on grassland birds? Why are they important? Well, grassland birds are indicators of ecosystem quality, indicators of pollinator habitat. They're really good at seed dispersal and consumption, pest insect consumption, pest rodent consumption, things like northern harriers, short-eared owls living on places eating rats and mice on farms like mine. And why are they indicators? You know, they're kind of like the canary in the coal mine. They require quality, healthy habitat, and that includes the structure of the vegetation, clean water, healthy soil, pollinators. They respond quickly to changes. We think back to when Europeans colonized Wisconsin, prairie chickens were only found in the southern third of the state. And we came in here, we cleared land, we stumped it, we started burning everything. We had the small dairy farm where we were milking 10 cows, small weedy grain fields, a lot of weeds on the landscape. Prairie chickens expanded statewide. They were once found in every county in Wisconsin, and now they're back into 2 counties in the central part of the state when the population's contracted. And grassland birds are really easy to observe and study. You know, I'll get into a little bit later about monitoring. And you stand out in a pasture in June, it's really easy to count bobolinks with those males that are flittering above your head and calling. So they're really easy for us to detect trends in bird populations. So I talk a lot about cattle and why cattle can help this. You know, the slide that you're looking at now shows the different grazing techniques and different grazing regimes that can benefit certain birds, and how we can use cattle to create a heterogeneous landscape so we have different habitat types to benefit different birds. So like on the left of your screen is the horned lark that requires really tightly grazed short grass and pastures. I actually find horned larks in my pastures where I outwintered cattle the year before, where it's matted down hay and manure and things like that. I find them nesting in there. Till we get into the middle section, the moderately grazed grass, and we get into things like meadowlarks, bobolinks, northern bobwhite quail, greater prairie chickens, upland sandpipers. And then we get all the way to the right, where we have a longer time since grazing. We have a lot of residual grass on the ground. We have taller grass. We start getting into things like Henslow's sparrows, clay-colored sparrows. So we can utilize cattle as a really great tool as long as they're managed correctly. So that brings me to why I have a job. So National Audubon Society looked at this decline of birds. This organization's 120 years old, and decided what can we do about this on a working lands landscape, because so much of our grasslands are owned by ranchers and farmers throughout this country. So the idea was spawned to create the Audubon certified bird friendly land certification. So what this is this is a certification that farmers and ranchers work with me to create a habitat management plan on their individual operations. And so I visit the site, we go over their operation, we understand their goals, they understand our goals, and then we put together a habitat management plan working with that farmer or rancher to increase biodiversity, but most importantly, to increase grassland bird populations on their individual ranches. And when the farmer or rancher agrees to do that, they achieve this Audubon certified seal that you see on the left of your screen. And what that seal can do is it's up to that producer to utilize it how they see fit. So I'm in the process of being certified on my own farm right now. Our Minnesota ecologist is working on my place, developing the habitat management plan and going through the auditing process to become certified. What I'm going to do is I sell at grocery stores. I'm going to work with the grocery stores to put banners up that show that consumers will be buying beef that is grazed and raised on Audubon certified lands. And I have another farmer that I'm certifying right now from central Wisconsin. He sells at the Dane County Farmers Market in Madison. He has 50,000 people walk by his booth Memorial Day weekend, and he wants an 8-foot banner that shows that his farm is certified by Audubon for bird friendliness. The idea is that seal, if used correctly, can kind of set you apart, and you really use it as a marketing tool to increase your sales on your farm. So I'm going to go through what we've done here in the last year. So far in Wisconsin, since July of 23, since I came on, we have 35 interested farms and ranches totaling 6,000 acres. This just went up another 30 ranches and probably another 6,000 acres. We were at a conference called Grassworks 2 weekends ago, and we had about 30 more people sign up that want us to do a site visit. So this is starting to be real acreage in Wisconsin. So I talked earlier about monitoring. One of the big things that we're doing with ACR in Wisconsin is monitoring birds on ranches to determine, are the habitat management plans that we're creating working on these farms? So we got started this last June with our first initial ranches that are being certified. So we surveyed 9 places. I'm going to go through some successes here real quick. The farm I was just telling you about that south of the Dane County Farmers Market, he's in the Central Wisconsin Grassland Conservation Area, or CWGCA. He had 38 bobolinks on his place. And these numbers of birds I'm going to go through are people that I call won the monitoring game our first year, right? That had the most birds on their places. But I'm really proud of this guy and the work he's already doing, and the work that we can continue to do to even up this number. Then from there, we go to the Western Prairie, St. Croix County, another certified rancher. He had 22 eastern meadowlarks on his place. I was not able to survey. We had a consultant that was surveying, and I was really jealous because as I start going through this list of birds, you're going to see this gentleman he won almost every award for the greatest number of species on his place. One other cool thing, when the consultant emailed us the results that day, he was joking with us, but he talked about this really tall white bird that was out there that had tarsal bands on both of its legs. And this rancher actually had a pair of whooping cranes on his place the day that the survey was done. Again, in the Western Prairie in St. Croix County, he had 29 Savannah sparrows on the morning of our survey. He also had 31 sedge wrens. Can you imagine standing out there in June with the bird noise that must have been out there the day when he had 23 eastern meadowlarks and that many sedge wrens? And one of my favorite grassland birds is upland sandpiper. This gentleman on this farm, he in the southern driftless grasslands just outside of Dodgeville, he recently seeded his entire farm back to grass. It was a corn and soybean operation, and he seeded it back to grass and brought in stocker cattle. So he's buying beef calves in the spring, grazing them all summer, and then selling them in the fall. But he's doing it in a really great bird-friendly way. And on that place, he had 3 upland sandpipers. And I don't know how many you know, but upland sandpipers are a really hard bird to achieve on the landscape. They're relatively rare in Wisconsin. They need wide open expanses of grass and the right kind of grass. And so I'm really proud that Mike had 3 upland sandpipers on his place. Then we go back to the Western Prairie in St. Croix County, and Dave had 38 dickcissels also on that morning of surveying. 23 grasshopper sparrows again on Dave's place. So we surveyed my farm, and while I had really good numbers of birds, I had like 28 bobolinks and I think 14 eastern meadowlarks and a bunch of savanna sparrows. I wasn't able to achieve that top spot, but this is a picture of my UTV the morning of our survey. All that stuff that you see on the ATV there are bugs and insects from driving through a pasture that we were surveying. So I like to say that I won the award for the most bugs on a farm that day. And like we talk about prairie, right? We talk about all these native species, but I'd like to point out that most of these farms and ranches in Wisconsin currently are non-native cool season grasses that they use for grazing, including this field that my UTV is sitting in, which is a mixture of orchard grass, timothy, red and white clover, and a few other species. But we had great bobolink numbers, great meadowlark numbers, and we were watching them carry food, which you can tell it wasn't very hard for them to find food. And so it's sort of like a surrogate prairie and a surrogate grassland that we can raise these birds in on these grazing farms. But maybe the most important part of us doing these surveys is a map like this that I'm showing you right now. So we put together these pie graphs on this individual farm, and this is Kirsten's farm in Jefferson County. And what this is able to do is inform management decisions, and it's a really great tool for me to be able to take to the farmer's kitchen table and have lunch and sit and look at this and show them where we're finding the greatest diversity of grassland birds and the most grassland birds on their place. And now that we look at this from an aerial photograph point, you can kind of tell pretty easily why the greatest diversity of grassland birds are where they're at on the farm. Grassland birds really do not do well in fragmented landscapes with tree lines. And if you look on this farm, you can see where this is very fragmented in this area. And you get down here where it's even more fragmented. The diversity of birds in the south end of this farm is less than the diversity of birds that are found smack in the middle of the biggest portions of grassland. So a place like this, we'll start working with this producer to remove these tree rows. And I'll get into it in a minute why we want to do that. But we'll be working with them, and this person's becoming certified through Audubon Conservation Ranching. So that'll be part of the goals in the next 3 years to start removing those off the landscape and opening it back up. So that brings me to why we'd want to remove these tree rows. One of the greatest threats, and perhaps the biggest threat to our grassland biome throughout North America, is woody encroachment. I took this picture on the left from a presentation out that in South Dakota by Duroc Twidwell from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. If you guys ever get a chance to listen to somebody who's so well versed in the perils of our Great Plains and our native prairies, it's Duroc out of Nebraska. He's a wonderful individual, really smart, is really doing a really great job through our Great Plains. But that photo on the left where it shows red, that's pretty much eastern red cedar cover that's starting to cover our Great Plains and other brush cover. Now that picture's of the Great Plains. I know we're in Wisconsin, but we're starting to see eastern red cedar really start taking over the St. Croix River Valley, the southern driftless grasslands. And we're seeing other species, like buckthorn, multiflora rose, all these invasive species that are really taking over our grasslands. This is a picture from the southern driftless grasslands on a really pretty driftless farm. And it was promoted by another organization to plant hybrid poplar and rose through the trees. And this is all grass. This is a grazing farm. I was on this place in mid-June and did not hear one single grassland bird on the place. Without these trees, I would expect we would have probably heard 20 meadowlarks, 30 bobolinks, but we heard zero grassland birds on this whole place when we were there. It's fragmented too much for them. So we have issues with this, with new tree row planting, old tree rows that are on the landscape. So you're probably asking, how do you know about these tree rows? Like, how do you know that impacts grassland birds? This is a study that was done in the mid 2000s, about 2005 to 2007 by UW-Madison, and looked at the impacts of tree rows on grassland birds and potential nest predators. And they were looking at before and after of removal of tree rows. So they looked at nest success, nest density of grassland birds before a tree row removal and then after a tree row removal. What they found, and I'm going to just put it in a nutshell, is grassland bird densities increased, nesting densities increased. However, nest success did not increase. So you might ask yourself, well, if nest success did not increase, did it really matter? Well, let's take, for example, if prior to tree row removal, we had 2 bobolink nests. Well, that density of nests increased and it actually doubled. So now we have 4 nests. And if it stayed at the same nest success, we actually doubled the number of birds that we produced on that place. Woodland associated predators were probably the biggest, or were the biggest detriment to grassland bird nests in the study. When they removed the tree rows, it nearly ceased. It was a 9-fold decrease for raccoons, because what happens, raccoons are a woodland predator. They don't like grasslands. But with these linear features of tree rows in the landscape, and these big den trees, they'll walk out into the grasslands and then they can smell the nests and go out and get them. The interesting thing is when we removed the woodland predators, we saw an increase in grassland associated predators like 13-line ground squirrels. So we actually made habitat better for small mammals that are in grasslands by removing those tree rows also, which is very interesting. Something very unexpected from this study that showed up. If you think back to the early 2000s in Wisconsin, we had really, really high deer densities in Iowa County where this study was done. This was right when we first found CWD, chronic wasting disease, in that area when densities were stupid high. A large percentage of nests were actually depredated by white-tailed deer. They put trail cameras on these nests to try to understand what the predator dynamic was, and they found, I think it was like 46% were from white-tailed deer. It'd be interesting to see that study now that deer densities have decreased a lot in their area, but it's just kind of a fascinating side note of that deer are out eating bobolink eggs. So the takeaway message, and I'll just read this quote from that study, was, because of gains in habitat, increased use by birds, greater production of young, and the effective removal of woodland-associated predators, tree row removal, where appropriate based on the predator community, can be a beneficial management action for conserving grassland birds and improving fragmented and degraded grassland ecosystems. I'd like to point out the picture on the bottom right of prairie chickens. This picture was taken February 19th of 1939. This was Chippewa County, Wisconsin, about 5 miles from my farm. This gentleman was on the back of the photo, on the original that we have, he wrote a note that he was feeding these things in the winter, and he hid in the corn shucks that you see in the background and took this photo in late February of 1939. It just blows my mind that we had this many prairie chickens throughout Wisconsin. And now we've almost lost them all. So can we get there? Can we get people to cut trees down? We have sort of a love affair in this country with trees. Most of the people in the crowd today, I'm guessing, don't, because you're here for a prairie enthusiast conference. But if I ever wanted to have any hope that we can work on people to remove woody vegetation, remove trees from the landscape for the betterment of a prairie, that hope gained some strength last spring when I was in South Dakota at this conference. This gentleman in the slide is Lyle Perman. He was a 2014 South Dakota Leopold Conservation Award winner. He always had a saying when he was younger to be a leader and plant a cedar. He thought that planting rows of eastern red cedars on his ranch and in east central South Dakota and the Missouri River breaks was a great idea. As he matured in his ranching career, he saw the detriment of those eastern red cedars to not only bird populations, but to his bottom line, because they suck a lot of water out of the landscape, and his grass production was going down with not only the ones he planted, but then he started getting volunteer eastern red cedars on his ranch. So they have actually started to remove all the eastern red cedars off their ranch, reintroducing prescribed fire, bringing back native grasses through the use of fire, and getting rid of those cedars. So if old ranchers from South Dakota can get on board with removing woody vegetation, I'm pretty sure that we can get folks in Wisconsin to do the same. So I'm going to switch gears right now to some other habitat work that we're currently doing since I came on in Wisconsin. The pictures you're looking at are on the Paul J. Olson Wildlife Area in central Wisconsin, one of the 2 last remaining prairie chicken populations. The tree row you see on the left is a tree row separating a private farm from some DNR managed land. And the gentleman that I showed earlier, who had the 38 bobolinks, makes hay in the field in the foreground. He grazes DNR land in the background on the other side of that tree row. And then his farm is further to the right, where he grazes. We were able to secure some private funding from an individual in central Wisconsin who really likes prairie chickens and grassland birds. So we have a fund where we can hire contractors to go in and do some habitat work for grassland birds. So the picture on the left and the picture on the right is before and after. This happened 3 weeks ago. So what this tree row removal did is it now opened up a 2.5 mile view shed for prairie chickens. We have 2.5 miles of grass looking from where the picture was taken to the north. Really opened it up. The trees that you can see, well, I'll go to the next slide. We talk about woody encroachment in the Great Plains. The picture on the left is that DNR pasture that you can see. If you look at you can see a white fence post on the right-hand side of the photo, and all that brush on the left. That's woody encroachment that happens in Wisconsin if we don't graze, burn, things like that. We hired contractors that same week. They cut the tree row down, and that's what it looks like on the right now. And it's already fenced. So this next spring, we are going to bring cattle into that with that farmer and graze that. And those cows will eat all the new shoots of aspen and whatever else tries to come back in there. And we'll eventually be able to restore that to grassland. The next plan is all those trees you see further to the left is removing that. And that will then open up about a 3 mile view shed looking east and west for prairie chickens in that area. This is a 1/2 mile down the road on another property that's all grass, which will eventually be burned. There was a lot of these standing white pine trees, a lot of dead elm, ash in there, and it wasn't being used by prairie chickens very much. We hired a contractor, and in a day and a half, we had all the trees gone on that property, and they're all down in big brush piles, and they'll be burned next winter when they've dried out. And now we'll have a more treeless landscape in that area. So what else are we doing? A very exciting part of working here is working with our brilliant grant writers, specifically Sarah in Minnesota, who we work with very closely. We wrote a grant this last year called Grazing the Bar. So what this grant is doing is helping to pay for grazing infrastructure. So things like fence, water line, will pay to seed fields back to pasture, back to hay fields. We're paying for brush removal, paying for prescribed fire. We're modeling it after USDA's EQIP program, except farmers don't have to go through the bureaucracy to be funded by the applying and going through batching process and being ranked. And sometimes that can take a year or more. So when we work with a farmer, we can actually initiate the project right away and get it done in a really short time frame. So that grant is a $2.5 million grant called the Conservation Innovation Grant from USDA. So one of the things we're testing is that quick strike, if you will, of habitat, where we can get it done quickly. But perhaps the most interesting part and exciting part of this are what our colleague Jen liked to call BOPs, because everything needs to have an acronym, right? But BOP stands for Bird Occupancy Payments. So when we sign a rancher up or a farmer up for this program, we're going to monitor the farm, and in their habitat management plan, we'll have a list of priority bird species for grassland birds on that place. And if they achieve 75% of those birds, we're going to pay them for having those birds on their place. They can get $5,000 per year for 2 years. So a farmer can get $10,000 just for hosting meadowlarks or bobolinks and prairie chickens and things like this. It's a little different than our North American model of wildlife management. That states that wildlife is owned by the states. Things like the Lacey Act, where you can't transport them across state lines, and where you cannot sell wildlife. So you cannot sell the meat of animals and whatnot. But so what we're doing, though, is actually just paying for that habitat and then paying for those birds being on there. Like, what is it? And then we're going to try to figure out, what is it worth to that farmer or rancher? What did it take for them to want bobolinks and meadowlarks? Is it just because they have a conservation ethic, or does it take getting paid to have that and providing that ecosystem services for all of us who love birds to have that prairie, that grassland on their place, and then subsequently having those birds and providing a home for those populations? So with that, I think that's about all that I have, and we can open it up for questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Ashley. You can stop presenting now too. That way we can all see your face. Wonderful. So we do have quite a few questions I'm happy to relay over to you. People are really interested in this topic. Eddie Tice Paradis is interested about the financial incentives for landowners to get Audubon certified. I know you talked about the marketing about this, but are you aware of other financial incentives?
Yeah, so Audubon does not pay you per se to be certified on their places. It's really up to that producer for the marketing of it. With that said, we think that we bring a lot of value to ranches just by the amount of time that we spend with you on your place, writing a habitat management plan. Certain situations that I'm working on now in Wisconsin is we're getting grazing plans written by the NRCS and by other folks for your places. In Wisconsin, we have a specific grassland bird equip program. So when we do things like refuge areas on your farm during the nesting season, from haying or grazing, this grassland bird equip program can actually pay you to defer those acres. But from just a certification standpoint, we do not pay farmers and ranchers for that.
Okay, good to know. Also wondering, is this program only applicable to open grasslands, or are you working in any oak savanna habitats as well? Greg Heberlein is wondering how the bird populations are or are not affected in those ecosystems, since there are scattered trees.
That's a really great question. In southern Wisconsin, well, throughout Wisconsin, but mainly in the southern driftless area, one of our focal species is red-headed woodpeckers and orchard orioles, and those birds obviously need oak savannas. So where appropriate on the landscape, we really want to work on restoring oak savanna habitat.
Okay. Mike Healy is curious about what native prairie species do you recommend for planting into actively grazed prairies?
That's a really good question from Mike. So we have people that are sort of run the gamut, right? Everybody loves big blue stem and Indian grass, and the research shows that running beef steers in the summertime on native grasses in July and August can put upwards of 3 to 4 pounds of a gain on a beef steer a day. the thing with prairies and I think what this data really proves out when when we're doing our monitoring is if we're planting species like big blue stem, Indian grass that grow so tall that we need some sort of disturbance like grazing throughout that growing season to keep that structure in place and have it not get quite so tall. Because what we're seeing is in restored native prairies where this grass is so thick and so tall, we're not seeing bird usage like we think we should. So there's something to do with grazing in there, whether it be cattle or bison, that we need animals grazing these native warm season prairies to keep the structure right on the places. So what I'm actually encouraging people to do if we're not going to be grazing or haying native warm seasons, that especially in areas in central Wisconsin where we have prairie chickens and bobolinks and meadowlarks, is that we should be looking at shorter growing species like little blue and other species like that that aren't going to grow quite as tall and perhaps not as thick when we go. Because when we look at grassland birds, they typically don't like that 7 or 8 foot tall stuff that we see.
Good to know. So our attendee, Jay Rutherford, lives in Northwest Illinois and is surrounded by dairy and beef cattle farms. Do you have any colleagues in that area that can help implement this program?
That's a great question. So I'm assuming he's in the Driftless area of Northwest Illinois, and we're not there yet, but our plan is to be very shortly. We're currently in the Driftless of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and we need to add that Illinois portion into that. And we're currently working on getting enough staff to cover that.
Okay, we'll stay tuned for more information. Nancy Glow is curious about how you keep the cattle from trampling the bird nests in that area.
That's a great question. So that's one of the things when we write habitat management plans that we work on. So we take remember that pie graph chart, we take the very best areas of the farms and we encourage people to either graze very lightly during the nesting season, or we leave that completely ungrazed until the nesting season is over. But it's really interesting if we're not putting a lot of cattle and we're not intensively grazing an area. Anecdotally, see it on my place, see it on other people's places, is cattle will actually know that nest is there, and a lot of times they don't get trampled. Of course, there is trampling that does occur, but a lot of times you'll actually, like I had a meadowlark nest where I watched the cows eat around that, which was very interesting to me. But we don't stock really heavy. But we want to definitely take our best areas and try to leave those as refuges during the nesting season.
Very interesting. Another question from Mike Healy. So he's curious about what you're doing to educate other organizations about the larger ecological impact of well-intentioned silvopasture tree plantings.
That's a very good question from Mike. You know, we're working with other organizations. We've hosted workshops on where trees should be planted, where trees shouldn't be planted, and looking at the ecosystem as a whole and what are those tree plantings going to do for that ecosystem. So we're actively engaged with other organizations to do that.
Okay. So you spoke a lot about cattle on the grazing areas, but Addie Tice Paradis and Ellen Thomas are also wondering, is this program applicable to other grazing animals, bison, or anything else?
So currently we're certifying cattle and bison. The conversation has just started literally in the last month to look at sheep and goat grazing and small ruminants. There's a lot of grazers in Wisconsin grazing sheep who are doing wonderful things on their ranches for grassland birds. And it's past due that we start recognizing those folks and having a certification for small ruminants. So we're currently working on that, and our national directors have brought that up, and the conversations are happening. So.
Wonderful. So I have kind of a potential storyline to work out with you from Alan McQuarrie. And he's wondering, I think, about the density of trees or removing all trees. So he's saying if you were going to plant 20 trees, he assumes it would be better for bird habitat to cluster those as opposed to planting in a row of trees. His assumption is based on keeping a property line 80% open and clustering the trees in the other 20%. Do you have any guidance on that?
I do, and it's really about siting that tree planting properly. I'll use one ranch for example that I'm working on in very southwestern corner down by Dickeyville, Wisconsin. Is the wife on the farm wanted to have a grove of trees, and where they were going to plant it would have fragmented grassland bird habitat, and they have a lot of meadowlarks on their place. And so we worked with them, and they had a spot behind their house. It was like this corner of the farm where it was a hay field that was kind of a pain to farm, and we actually sited that tree grove there. Between a building and the house and the road, it's not gonna hurt anything on that farm for grassland birds. So it's really siting it, and then also he's correct about small patches of trees. If you really want trees, the thing is to keep that linear feature off the landscape.
Okay. So there are a lot of changes in what's happening with funding, both at a national level, local level, things like that. Do you see any threats happening with the ability to fund this program in the future? Kathleen Carlisle is wondering.
Yeah, I think right now we're in a really crazy time, right? And a lot of us are holding our breath of what's going to happen next. The news came out last night that a couple 100,000 federal employees were fired, and a lot of those were new employees at NRCS and other federal organizations that we work with. So yes, it's definitely a concern of ours. And personally, I have a $200,000 grant earmarked for sharp-tailed grouse conservation on private lands in northwest Wisconsin. That's part of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative that we were awarded, but it's currently frozen at the federal government level right now. So we're sort of waiting to when that comes back, if it will. So yeah, it's definitely a concern.
Okay. Well, Jim Hewitt is really excited to see those numbers of grassland birds on the properties. And he's also curious about if you have any data about breeding success and if there's any mortality from the presence of grazing animals or hay cutting practices.
There is some of that data out there from that study that I talked about. I don't have it off the top of my head, but for the ACR part, we are not looking at nest success on the places. We're basically looking at trend data on our monitoring on the farms to see, and we create what's called a bird friendliness index. And I'll spare you all the stuff that goes into it because it's even more complicated than what I care to know. But we try to look at it, and it's a number between 0 and 1. And what the idea is to look at that trend data to see if we're trending up or down with our management practices.
Okay. Curious about the minimum amount of land that would be required. Debbie Bocher is wondering about that.
That's a question we get all the time, and it's a great question. Grassland birds need big open landscapes. Initially, we said that we were going to go with a minimum of 100 acres in Wisconsin to be certified, but we actually got rid of that, and we said it's going to be at the discretion of myself as a grassland ecologist. One of the reasons why is I was on a farm in by Viroqua, Wisconsin, in the Driftless, and it was 35 acres of grass, but it was on a ridge top where you could see for miles, and there were bobolinks and eastern meadowlarks and dick sissels and Savannah sparrows and grasshopper sparrows that were utilizing, because of his management was great with his cattle. But that really opened my eyes to these smaller properties situated right on the landscape can be a really good opportunity for grassland birds.
Okay. Jack Markin has an interesting question about what are your stocking rates and rotation schedule for cattle on grasslands?
So that question is one I can't answer that well. That all depends on the individual ranch and what their situation is for grassland birds. Like we have one place where they have several small fields that would never be good for grassland bird habitat. So we actually stock them pretty heavy during the spring flush, which middle of May till July 1st. But then we rest the middle of the farm. That's the best grassland birds. So we actually we'll hit the other stuff pretty hard in the spring because it's not affecting grassland birds. And then when we bring cattle into the areas where it is good for grassland birds, we'll mob graze that And so we'll use temporary fencing to really dial down the size of the paddock. So we'll mob graze it so then we can trample most of it after the birds are out of there and get a really good regrowth for the for stockpile grazing in the fall. So every farm is different in terms of our stocking rates.
Okay. John Rigdon is asking if you have any guidelines or guidance for timing on when you put up hay in the fields with the nesting grassland birds.
Yeah, so the dates typically, depending on the property, are July 15th or August 1st. The August 1st date is to protect Henslow sparrows. Henslow sparrows are known to nest later, and sometimes they're still pulling off nests in the last half of July. So it all depends on the focal species on that individual farm of when you should be making hay. And again, it's kind of utilizing the best practice on each farm. So that farm I showed at the pie graph on Kirsten's farm, she's going to start making hay on the small fields that are not grassland bird habitat. And we're going to make that in the middle of June when the quality of the hay is still really good, but not affecting grassland birds, and leave what they traditionally made in the best areas for that nesting season until after July 15th.
Okay. So after clearing trees, often areas can fill with invasive species. And James McGee is asking if there's any kind of follow-up to control invasives after you've done that work and what you propose doing.
Yeah, so what we're doing, and several of these tree rows have buckthorn and honeysuckle in them. When we're cutting them, we're cutting all the trees and the shrubs at ground level as close to the ground as we can. And we're actually treating the stumps with a chemical to kill that plant. And then the reason we're cutting them so low is then we're encouraging the farmer to leave that in grass and create grassland bird habitat. So either graze that area or come in once a year with a brush hog on a tractor and mow that fence row, and to keep that invasive brush back.
Okay. And can you speak to the types of areas that are being grazed and enrolled in this program? Have they been grassland historically? Or are you converting things? Nancy Glow is curious just about what the area had been like previously.
Yeah, the answer is both. My farm in particular was all corn and soybeans when we bought it in 2014. And now we have 55 acres of native warm season prairie. And then all the rest of it, 100 and some acres, is cool season grasses for grazing that we utilize. So we went from 0 bobolinks, and this last year we had 28 bobolinks on our place. And that just started in 2014. We have some grazers like that gentleman in St. Croix County that won almost every category. He's been in grass forever. He's been a cattle guy. So part of why he has so many birds is it's been there a long time, but also his management and also his landscape position. He's in that western prairie area of western Wisconsin, where we have a lot of publicly owned grasslands around, and also a lot of grazers in that area.
Fascinating. So Mike Healy is active in the chat. So I'm having another Mike question. Can you describe your experience with patch burn grazing in prairies, and if you have any good references that you could share?
So patch burn grazing is something that if we could get every farmer to do patch burn grazing, we should do it. The data on grass quality and the nutrition of grass after a burn is pretty clear that it's a much better grass, put on really good weight on cattle on that. Unfortunately in Wisconsin, and as Mike knows in the business he's in, that the burn culture is pretty low yet. And if we can figure out a way to make it economical for farmers to burn and do patch burn grazing, that would be outstanding. There's other states. Missouri is one that comes to mind, and in their last remaining native prairie chicken range is they're doing patch burn grazing on public lands down there. So I would encourage Mike, he's got my phone number, to if we could get with some farmers to do this, that would be outstanding, and point them. But I'm definitely promoting it to farmers that I'm working with.
There you go. There's an invitation to you, Mike, to follow up. All right. I have another question about any resources you can share. You had previously mentioned about wanting to expand the program.
You froze on me. You're still frozen. Hello? Are you back?
I hope I'm back. Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Sorry, everybody. Technology, there's a winter storm coming and things happen. So thank you for your patience. So I was trying to relay a question from Julia Sandstrom about other resources or references that you can share for people interested in enrolling this program for grazing sheep or any other animals that could be on this program plan in the future.
Yeah, as of right now, we do not have our protocols written for small ruminant animals. There's things we have to do for health and animal welfare that's part of our protocols, and things we have to figure out. I think most of it's going to be very similar to cattle and bison, but we're really not there yet. So if she wants to, if you can share my email address or whatever thing, these people, I'm happy to take emails from them and to stay in touch.
Yeah, and anybody interested in wanting more information, Ashley's information will be in the speakers panel, so you can reach out to him directly there. And I know Carl Nelson, you had a question about that and asking to arrange a visit to your property. So yes, please reach out to Ashley. I have no doubt you'd be curious to know. Okay. Emily Martell is wondering about grassland birds. They use small grain fields like winter wheat for nesting. Do they do that? And if so, could small grain farms be certified with this program?
It's so nice to hear familiar names on this call. So, hi, Emily. We will get out to your farm, I promise. That's a very good question. So, when we had the most grassland birds in the landscape, things like prairie chickens, when we had a lot more small grain farms, and not only small grain farms, but small grain farms that had weedy edges. So, on my farm, for example, where we outwinter cattle, the next year we plant corn there. There's a couple of reasons we do that: to try to feed deer, to keep them off our hay, because deer are a really big problem for us. So we plant food away from where our hay for the next winter is, to try to keep them off of it. But we don't spray that corn. So we get a lot of lamb's quarters and other annual agricultural weeds growing on the margins of that. And we just leave that. And I've had flocks of 50 bobolinks in that during migration in August, eating that high energy seed on those annual weeds. So yes, farms with small grains, we can definitely start that conversation. And ultimately, it would be a mosaic of small grains and grassland. So we'd be able to provide the habitat needs for the bird throughout the year.
Okay. Henry Panowitz is interested in knowing about if you have any guidelines or research about the frequency of these prairies being hayed. Sometimes prairies are being hayed twice or 3 times a year. And do you have any data about that?
Yeah, so in our protocol, we encourage native warm season hay to only be made once a year, and to be made in mid to late July when it's at its highest quality. And then we want to see that regrowth the rest of the year, that will provide the residual grass needed for those grassland birds to nest the following year. We have a gentleman in Southwest Wisconsin who's growing big blue stem for hay. He's getting 3 to 4 ton of hay in one cutting in July, and he's been able to reduce his nitrogen use, his phosphorus use, all of his fertilizers he's been able to reduce, and he's not losing any production on those stands of big blue stem. So I really think that native warm seasons should be a portion of every farmer's hay ground in Wisconsin, because we're making it late and we're making it after the nesting season, and it's really high quality versus when we're letting these cool season fields go until the mid to end of July. The quality is way down compared to warm seasons. The problem that we run into, as all of you prairie practitioners know, is that 3-year waiting period from when we seed it to when we actually have a really good stand of it. And that's something that we're trying to work past right now.
Okay, I have one more question for you. So great timing. Thank you for all the questions, everybody. This last one is from Dave Laufenberg, and he's wondering if you know about any studies that compare bird populations in restored prairie with grazing versus without grazing.
It's a good question, Dave. I do not know of any literature on that at the moment.
I saw you smile. You must know Dave as well.
Dave did some surveying for us last spring for our monitoring efforts. So
lots of friendly faces bringing the community together. Well, Ashley, thank you so much for your time today. Really interesting discussion. Thank you, attendees, for all your questions. This is really fun to bounce ideas back and forth. If you want to get in touch with Ashley, like I said, all of his information is in the speakers panel. You can send him a message and connect. And then our next presentation is a student presentation at 1 o'clock today. So we have a little bit of a lunch break, and then we'll go back to concurrent sessions at 2 o'clock. But thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
thank you.